afternoon, everyone, all the people around the country. Hopefully, you all can hear us. We are having a bit of a problem with the technical side, but in any case, this talk has been recorded and you would be able to access it on YouTube and a couple of other platforms. So I just want to welcome Sam Woodley, our guest speaker. For those who don't know Sam, she is, if I may say, an old friend of ours from the early 70s, and we've always had long-running battles between the BC and the Communist Party or the NIHSS people. But nevertheless, Sam is a very dear friend. She is one of our leading liberation struggle stalwarts and member of the Black Consciousness movement. But for me, one of the most important things about Sam is being her role as a cultural worker, as somebody involved in theater and poetry and all the various arts from the 70s or even earlier. And most important, she worked closely with Mafika Gwala, who was also very active in the Black Consciousness movement, and she would say a little bit more about him. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks so much. Well, yes, we go back as far as 1966, if I'm quite correct, when I got to Durban from Dundee and met in Wills Road. So our days go back to the days of University of Natal then. I must say thank you to South African History Online for inviting me to this lecture on Pascal Gwala and his writing as a weapon of culture, but emerging from the Black Consciousness movement. I'd like to start, Omar, with a quotation by Mpotlane wa Bofelo. And he said, the loss of history is the loss of memory. And the loss of memory is the loss of consciousness. And the loss of consciousness is the loss of being and is the loss of self. And on those grounds, I'd like to take you back into the cultural journey of Pascal Gwala as he traversed the path of Black consciousness in the 70s, of course. His personal, political, and social experiences through hardship, pain, humiliation, degradation, isolation, even during imprisonment, his experience of poverty and loss, and of the later years, his struggle to survive when really there was nobody around him in the last of his years. Right till the end, all this built the power within him. And out of this arose his evolving consciousness. His sensitivity, of course, to a cold, uncaring world led him to become a poet, an essayist, researcher, a storyteller, a community developer, earning him the title of a resilient, revolutionary writer, using his writing as a cultural weapon to expose and combat the ills of society. I want to go back to an interview he had with Tengameshlu Ngwenya, published in the Staff Rider in an article titled Towards a National Culture. It is here that we learn more about Pascal's early writing around 1966 and 1967, and we learn more about his teaching in the Transkei around the 70s, and then his arrival in Durban in 72. This, of course, was the turning point for him. And he says this turning point was when he actually joined the South African Student Organization, SASO. And that began his understanding, in quote, the meaning and dimension of his Blackness. And it is then, he says, that he began to appreciate his own background and what Africa actually meant to him. In his first collections, Jolin Nkomo was an inspiration for him, and it was an inspiration from a song by Miriam Makeba. One song from Makeba was about encouraging young maidens when their men went off preparing to war. For Pascal, he says, my Jolin Nkomo, and in his own words, was to bring some lines home to the crowd of my Black experience. How interesting. But it cannot be denied that within his Jolin Nkomo were also songs of encouragement, just like Maria Makeba's. But when one looked further into his poems, he strove to negate the cultural systems imposed upon Black communities by the white oppressor. In the staccato rhythm of his poem, Perspectives, he beats out the values that we have imbibed so easily. He sculptures, in fact, the broken pieces of our own mosaic lives. And this is how it went. His poem says, ties, Sunday suits, hair relaxes, complexion lotions, Mercedes, Jaguars, whiskey and soda, Durban July, faked nails, bank accounts, installments, all rise in the darkness to which we fall. Of course, he subtly reminds us how this way of life creeps in silently and how unknowingly and unwittingly we forget our roots. His role, he believed, was that of awakening the consciousness of his people, and in so doing, to break the complacency they were so steeped into. And that was the early 70s. Then you noticed, for too long, Black communities believed in the stereotypes of Blacks being lazy, unable to work, not capable of thinking for themselves, waiting to be served, waiting for handouts. Nothing has changed, has it? So the challenge of Black consciousness was for the Black communities to, 1, redefine, 2, re-identify, and 3, reappraise their lives. And for Pascal, redefining was the beginning. Now, Reverend Bartman, Ernest Bartman, an Anglican minister at the Methodist Church at Regina Mundi in Soweto in 1970, when asked, what is it to be Black? He said, it is when the Black man says no to white racism in all forms oppressive and paternalistic. When the Black man says no to the arrogance of the white verganters, verlichters, liberals, and the progressives. No more is he going to fit into a non-white portrait, and no more will he continue his own indignity, and no more will the white man be the Black man's yardstick to humanity. So Pascal, too, in the same vein, introspecting of what is Black, in his poem, Getting Off the Ride, he questions and asserts, and he says, I ask again, what is black? Black is when you get off the ride. Black is point of self-realization. Black is a point of new reason. Black is point of no national deception. Black is a point of determined stand to be or not to be. So began Pascal's inward journey of searching for his identity. For the Black consciousness movement, a redefinition came in defining the self as being Black, not Indian, so-called Indian, not so-called colored, or Bantu, as registered or classified by the nationalist government. The mantle of Blackness was worn with pride and solidarity. Black had nothing to do, as we all know, with the pigmentation of the skin. There was a need to be self-defined and not defined by others. And I'd like to quote Biko on re-identification. And Biko said, it's very ironic, he said, I'm going to be me as I am. And you can beat me or jail me or even kill me, but I'm not going to be what you want me to be. And so the journey began. The journey began. So come March 1973, with the first banning of the Black consciousness leadership, Pascal became a regular visitor to the offices of the Black Community Programs, BCP, under the directorship of Professor Ben Kwapa, where Steve Biko and I worked on the research for Black Review. And that was when we had met after a few years of having met him really in 1969 at the University of Natal Black section. And what I noticed was that Pascal's passion for poetry was married into the Black community projects, firstly with our work in Kwamashu and Amlazi. He was perturbed by the social ills and challenges facing Black communities. He was committed to awakening the consciousness of complacent youth to face the injustices in them at that time. Influenced by the Black consciousness thinking of Wally Serote's poem, My Brothers in the Street, who've tasted rape of mothers and sisters, who grab bread from black mouths. Oh, you Black boys who spill blood as easy as saying, footsack, listen, it's Black mothers who are crying. Pascal then spoke to the outrageous lack of sensitivity that was slowly creeping into the youth of that time. His plea was to his Black brothers embedded in this poem. In the poem he called Let's Take Heed. And this appears in his collection, No More Lullabies. And his words were, take heed in your warbles through the night, so piss drunk, you don't know your name. Take heed, son. The bag you just snatched from the Black mama down frostly is all she had in this world, all she had to feed your brothers, your sisters, who narrowly missed abortion, the sewage pipe, and the pill. So Pascal in his writing explored issues of social injustice that impacted the everyday lives of Black communities. It was the aim of Black consciousness being defined as a way of life, to break the apathy of the youth, awaken their minds to all that was happening around them, break the silence, the outspokenness, to be outspoken, take responsibility, show respect, enhance pride, self-worth, and protect women and children in their midst. So hence, in the quest for a more human face, in the quest for our humanity, in the deep thrust to effect social change, Pascal, through his writing, very much like Biko, enunciated, it's time to pump back life into the empty shells, infuse ourselves with pride and dignity, remind ourselves in our complicity in the crimes we face, and put a stop to the evil that reigns in the country of our birth. And in his paper on the practical manifestations of Black consciousness, at the Black Consciousness Conference, he reiterates, it was at the Black Renaissance Conference, he reiterates how the movement was and should be as a back to the people movement. In fact, this was the guiding principle of the followers of Black consciousness and the thrust of Pascal's beliefs, and justifiably so, for he lived by the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, start with what they know, build what they have, but with the best leaders, when the work is done, the task is accomplished, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. And it was never claiming fame other than their own work. So through the kaleidoscope of the way of life of his people in the Transkei, Umlazi, Komashu, Inanda, Mpumalanga, Edendale, Sabantu village, Pascal captured their struggles. And through their resilience, he became resilient. He sang their songs, he sang their truths, becoming one with them, and through his art, he crafted words that penned their joy, their laughter, and their pain. His poetry was rooted in community. He founded the Mpumalanga Art Ensemble. Pascal believed in a working class arts movement. And this was clearly evident while contributing to the production and layout of Staff Rider magazine. I think you were there too, Omar. It was local community groups that determined the content of the Staff Rider magazine. Pascal would gather community art groups. He would provide a workshop environment out of which would emerge writers, art groups. He would provide a workshop environment out of which would emerge poets, visual artists, whose work would then be published in the Staff Rider. Staff Rider editor Andreas Oliphant, when discussing the impact of the Staff Rider magazine, said that the Staff Rider had a political agenda to raise consciousness of the African urban readership. The material used was of the people, from their lives, and of course, I see this very much in his poem called Gwala Ride. In that he says, don't pass. I looked back, don't pass. I went through my pockets, not they. They bit into my flesh, handcuffs. Came the Gwala. We crawled in. The young men sang. In the dark moment, it all became familiar. Pascal strongly believed that the writing of the people and his writing was a weapon of struggle. Now, focusing on the line, and the young men sang, it is clearly evident that music featured in much of Pascal's poetry. Many of his poems, infused through song and drum beats, were rallying cries at mass meetings, gatherings, funerals. His poetry was one of passion, one of fiction, one of legends. In some African cultural concepts, a paper that was prepared for IDAMASA, that was a Interdenominational Association of African Ministers of Religion at Edendale, at the Ecumenical Center in 1971. Pascal, with others, would sing, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." Yes, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And today, it is fast becoming part of our modern culture. A culture of defiance, self-assertion, and group pride. This is a culture that emanated from a situation of common experience of oppression. This is the modern culture for the restoration of our faith in ourselves, and therefore offers hope. It offers a hope in the direction we are taking from here on. But let me pause as a caution of warning. We really need to differentiate between pride and arrogance. Pride, for me, is being a state of mind, a manifestation of one's psychological liberation, while arrogance is a showing off of unleashed power emanating from weakness and vulnerability. And what do we see today, I ask? So I would like to, in conclusion, to talk about when Pascal questioned this idea of being a cultural activist, a cultural worker. Pascal was very quick to make reference to the liberal arts. And he said, in so doing, he said, liberal humanism detaches itself from conflict and merely comments on it, whereas cultural activism challenges social forces as well as the anti-freedoms imposed on us. Hence, his position as a revolutionary artist. So lastly, what did he mean when he wrote that he used writing as a cultural weapon? Pascal revolted against using language defined and accepted by Western dominant cultural standards. He opposed purist language. His language belonged to the language of the people, inflections of ghetto speak, not literary language, not art elite language. And he says this in his poem, in An Attempt at Communication. In that poem, he writes, "Speak easy, my brother. There's a lively chick with a dainty smile. There's an auntie's coo. Mama, look, lest we start some shindig. The spark tells me I'm not screwed up. I'm just booze feeding, just booze feeding." And that was sometimes his cantankerous nature of bellowing laughter that comes out in his poetry as well. Of course, his objective was to place imagination over purity and precision of expected norms of the English language. because later we see in many of his poems, he wrote in ethnic languages, and which was going back to the roots of his people. And so in his interview with Ngwenya, he felt that writing should not be, to quote, the refrigerated food of bourgeois culture. He quotes Sekou Touré, who said, "To take part in an African revolution, it is not enough to write a revolutionary song. You must fashion it with the people. The songs will come by themselves and of themselves. To be a cultural weapon, writing must become an act of solidarity with the downtrodden masses, the wretched of the earth." And then too, Pascal refused to be boxed into which critics labeled him as one of the Soweto poets, part of the protest poetry writers, an anti-apartheid activist. He didn't want to be boxed into those labels. I agree with the Staff Writer magazine description of him when they called him a daredevil who defied convention and who transgressed the imposition of any system that denied him to speak his truth as he saw it and experienced it. And that was Pascal. So, Omar, if we reflect on his writing as a cultural weapon, the brief that you had given me, let's extol him as a writer who was resilient and who, like most Black consciousness writers, had the courage to challenge the status quo. His poetry and essays are relevant today, just as they were to the struggles of the past. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, his work still lives on and more relevant today, more than ever. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was very, very illuminating. Just for your own background and for everyone, Pascal actually dropped out of university and found work in the early 60s with George Prasad. He worked for George Prasad as a clerk in his company in Verulam. And it was in Verulam that he comes into contact with people who nurtured his interest in literature, in theory, in Marxism. Pascal was a Marxist, voluminous reading. He read everything that came, via people, and that came from his contact with academics and others. He read voluminously, and his first collection of poetry was dedicated to Ivor Chetty. Ivor Chetty was a member of the Unity movement then, but those labels at that stage didn't make any difference because we all lived under the most difficult period in South African history in the 60s and the early 70s. And Pascal's interest in literature was enormous. He just devoured everything he could find. And so he started writing. I met Pascal in 1965, and we became very close friends. We would meet weekly. And we, together with others, helped set up cultural groups which were across Durban and in Hammersdale in particular. And those groups were cultural groups, but they were also political groups. And so what is interesting about the Mapumulanga art ensemble that he set up with other comrades of his from that township is that majority of them were workers. They worked in the big textile mills in Hammersmith and they started writing. And we, Pascal and I, became friends with Mike Kirkwood long before staff writer when he was a lecturer at Natal University. And he had a little magazine which he edited, and and his biggest sales was from that township because they would buy 100 copies and distribute it in this township of Hammersmith. And what caught Mike Kirkwood, the editor of Staff Writer and Raven Press, was this group, and became very, very interested in them. And we all met and we began to talk and plan uh, and talk about culture and performances. And that's when we met with Mike Kirkwood, and Mike Kirkwood was about to leave Durban, leave his job at Natal University, and become the editor of Raven Press. And so the idea of a magazine, Staff Rider, was actually came out of that discussion between ourselves. And the notion of editorial control by the group and not just by individuals. So there were quite dramatic changes and thinking around literature, audience, and also censorship, because we lived in a period of extreme censorship, and most of the literary magazines were very small, but some were banned because of the type of work that they were producing. Nevertheless, Pascal worked in this group of ours, and then was asked to go and make friends with Steve Biko. And that's how I met Steve Biko, through Pascal, because Steve was a student initially at Marion Hill Seminary, and Pascal's friends at the at the center there, came to us and said, look, there's a very good guy in our matric class. You must come and meet with him. And that's how we met Steve. And his last year at high school. And that friendship between him and Pascal and others, was a lifelong friendship. When Steve was murdered by the security police, the impact of that on Black consciousness, on the country as a whole, was so dramatic. And I remember the next following day after Steve's murder, we sat and we just reminisced about him and the work, and we just said, right, work needs to be done, must continue. And so that was Pascal. He was, like all of us, were very, very, very drawn into the war in Southeast Asia, the liberation struggle against British American imperialism in Vietnam. And we followed it in great detail. And so Pascal read everything that he could find. And his influence on writers like Langa, Ben Langa, was was seminal because it was then Pascal actually helped Ben to, to get to write down his ideas and his thoughts. And so that's how Ben became a poet and a writer. So, you know, the period that we are living in and that he was very active and very central, it ran across a number of ideological divisions. And he became, in many ways, the one who created the bridges between groups. And his writing, interesting enough, I asked him, who influenced you as a poet? And he said, well, before we moved to Hammersdale, we lived in Verulam, and in an area that was mixed, Indians and colored and Africans. And a young matriculant who was his neighbor, a young Indian woman, encouraged him to write. He should write poems, love poems to her. And then she said, but you know, they're very nice. Thank you very much. But you need to go a little further and get really involved in literature. And so this was this two high school lovers uh, talking about literature and its impact on society. And so Pascal's experience ran across race, ran across townships, ran across age, and even up to now, the group that was established, or some of the people who are still alive from the group that is established in Hammersdale, still continue to work, still continue to influence the younger people in those communities and run cultural programs with them, program which continues to run up to today. So I'm just, and all, I think that one of the things that really had a huge impact on him is when all of the Black consciousness leadership was arrested, Steve and others who were arrested and held in detention. And when he came out, he was quite devastated by Steve's death and by his experience in prison. But nevertheless, he continued. He went on to become a writer, a successful writer, in the sense that his work was distributed widely, not success in terms of financial success, because there was none. A couple of months before he died, I was in regular contact with him, and I encouraged him to make copies of all the poems that he had written. A couple of days before he died, he found me feeling really distraught to say, and started crying. He said, Omar, I'm sorry. I want to tell you something about the poem. They got lost. He got into a taxi with a paper bag with all his poems in there. And he was going to come to Durban, sit in somebody's office and type them out. But he wasn't able to. He forgot that bag in the taxi. And when he went back looking for that taxi, it was gone. So a lot of his work was lost that way. And he was incredibly distraught. And this was not long after he passed away. And so one of the things that we did, myself and Ben Langer, was to ensure that we kept in touch, and he kept in touch in particular with artists and writers and all over Africa. In fact, he had a way of getting through people, going past censorship and things like that. And he had links with writers all across Africa. Anyway, thank you very much, Sam. And thank you, everyone who attended today's event. I'm sorry about the technical problems that we are facing, but I hope that you take something back from this talk and go and read his work. Sam, the first collection of poems that were published was dedicated to Iowa Chetty, because they were, he acknowledged Iowa's role in opening him up to literature and socialist ideas and things like that. A bit of history there. But yeah. So Dash, how are we for time? Because if there are any questions or contributions, it would be nice to hear from people. And before I forget, this.
Especially, I think there are some people wanting to ask questions. So.
Or contribute to this discussion.
Waiting for Bash.
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you to Ismail and his team at Poetry Africa for opening up the space for us to have this annual lecture series as part of Poetry Africa. And so the series goes far beyond what we initially started with students at Natal University, and it's now quite national. So are there any questions?
Yeah, so if I wanted to know more about the traditions of song in this period, where would I go for additional information, and what artists or what poets besides Miriam Makeba and Pascal Gwala would one want to look at to learn more about the importance of song and poetry in this period?
Well, that's an interesting question, because
there are
So Sam, you're breaking up. We can't really hear you.
International Festival had a video on the liberation song. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Yeah.
So, am I unmuted? Hi.
Yeah, it's fine. I can hear you. Carry on, Sam.
Sam, we can hear you.
Oh, no, we can't hear you now. Didn't really. Well, firstly, we must remember that we're talking about a period in which there was an enormous amount of censorship. There were not many literary magazines, a few in the country, and there wasn't a lot of space for poets and singers and musicians to perform. And if they did, they performed to a very limited audience. We've just had something about Julian Bahula and Malombo, which was a very, very popular group in that period. But we didn't record. We didn't have the technology or the money, and there wasn't a culture of listening to poetry. It was poetry, like art, like painting and other things that came out of the Black community, really began to emerge in the 60s, after Sharpeville, and in particular in the mid 60s. So, and even Miriam Makeba, we were not able to listen to everything that she had produced because quite a few of her albums and songs were banned and not played by the mass media or imported into the country. There were only one or two shops in the country. One was in Johannesburg and another in Durban that would import Miriam Makeba and other artists from the rest of Africa and from America, Black artists and musicians. So it wasn't culture in the sense that we know it and audiences as we knew it were not as developed as they were later. It took the Black consciousness movement, it took the Congress movement, it took the mass movement in the country to become the base on which cultural activity was nurtured, was used in a conscious way of getting to people. You must also remember there were not many libraries, and there were lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of books that were banned. And so getting hold of, say, for instance, the writing of Carmichael or other Black consciousness leaders in America, which we were very, very interested in, was not easy. It required a lot of hard work to smuggle that stuff into the country and to circulate it. One of the things that we did, Mafika and others, was that we created libraries. We had to create our own libraries. And yeah, so culture and this new culture was actually made popular by the liberation movement. Yeah, so I'm just giving you the sense of what culture and everything else was very tightly controlled by the regime. All literature was controlled. All writings were controlled. All productions were controlled or segregated. It took the liberation movement and the revival of organization to make culture a more popular thing and to nurture a new audience. Am I right, Sam? Because you were right at the beginning of this movement at that period.
Thank you, Omar. That was excellent. Thank you.
That what we should close with thanking Poetry Africa and Ismail and his team for making this space available and integrating our program, the Pascal Gwala annual lecture, into Poetry Africa, where it should be. So thank you very much, everyone who joined us today. And if you want, you're more than happy to go onto our website and read all the other 5, 6 annual lecture series, and they are really, really very, very good um, uh, reading and important reading for especially young people who don't know this period and who don't know Pastor Gwala. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Sorry.
Omar.
Can you hear me now,
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
yes.
Dash? Just as a word to Kanika, that archival materials on liberatory songs from the liberatory movements are found in music libraries and at the University of KwaZulu-Natal Music Department. There are also videos on done by during the International Film Festival. If you can access the liberatory songs videos that have been done. So you will be able to find the importance and the interpretation of those songs that we've been using at orally in the work fields, in the mines, in the in terms of the finding one's liberation. So you'll find there is definitely material available, just that you need to research, Kanika.